If you've been struggling to sleep, you've just stumbled onto the most boring video on YouTube. I know. That's a bold claim. But tonight we're talking about extinct plants that no one cares about. And yes, it's exactly as dull as it sounds. This is the very first installment of The Boring Files, a series where we dig into subjects so uninteresting, so profoundly irrelevant, that the only logical use for them is to help you drift off to sleep. Consider this your challenge. Try to make it all the way to the end without falling asleep. Few ever will. If you manage it, you may earn a strange kind of bragging right, though you'll have to decide if that's really something worth bragging about. When most people think of extinction, they picture dinosaurs, mammoths, or at least a bird that couldn't fly, something with teeth, tusks, or feathers. But plants? Plants tend to vanish without headlines. No museums, no bedtime stories, just silence and the occasional fossil pressed into rock. And yet, scientists have gone out of their way to catalogue them. Names you'll never remember, details you'll never need, fossils you'll never bother to look up. They are, in every sense, the perfect subject for this series. So settle in, because for the next 2 hours, we'll be exploring the thrilling, pulse-pounding history of plants that lived, died, and left behind absolutely nothing of interest. This is The Boring Files, extinct plants nobody cares about. Our first entry is not only extinct, it may not even have been a plant at all. Prototaxites lived during the Silurian and Devonian periods, over 400 million years ago. For decades, paleontologists argued about what this strange organism actually was. Some thought it was a tree, others argued it was a fungus, a few even suggested it was something in between, which is always science's way of admitting they have no idea. Whatever Prototaxites was, it was big. Fossils show it could grow up to 9 meters tall. That's about the height of a 3-story building. Imagine a giant column, wider than a person, rising out of a prehistoric landscape where almost everything else was knee-high moss. It would have been the only skyscraper in a world of shrubs. Not exactly scenic beauty, more like nature's idea of a traffic cone. Structurally, Prototaxites looked like a log standing on end. No branches, no leaves, just a massive pole made of mysterious tissue. If it sounds anticlimactic, that's because it was. Picture walking through a landscape of mossy ground cover and stumbling upon a giant featureless pillar. You wouldn't be impressed, you'd just walk around it. As for uses, humans never encountered it, so there were no logs to cut, no shade to sit under, no fruit to eat. If you were a Devonian arthropod, Prototaxites may have offered some shelter from the rain, assuming it rained in exactly the right spot. Beyond that, it was useless. Its most enduring contribution has been as a subject of endless academic papers, none of which have fully solved what it was. In other words, its greatest use is wasting researchers' time. And yet, there is something oddly appropriate about beginning here. The largest thing in its ecosystem, towering over everything else, but ultimately amounting to nothing, a monument not to glory, but to irrelevance. Of course, not every extinct plant, or possible not a plant, was massive. Some of them were so small you could miss them entirely, even if you were staring right at them. Our next stop is Cooksonia, widely regarded as the first true land plant. Spoiler, it looked like green toothpicks. After the towering mystery of Prototaxites, we move to something much smaller. Cooksonia is widely regarded as the first true land plant. You might expect the first land plant to look dramatic, perhaps some lush fern or a leafy shrub making its grand debut. In reality, Cooksonia looked like green toothpicks, thin, upright stalks with little spore capsules on top. No leaves, no flowers, no fruit, just sticks. Cooksonia appeared around 425 million years ago during the Silurian period, a time when life was still testing out the idea of living on land. Most of the planet was barren rock and dirt, with occasional puddles. Into this desolate scene, Cooksonia bravely poked its head up. Not that there was much to see. Standing only a few centimeters tall, it would have been easy to miss unless you were an inchworm. Its structure was astonishingly simple. A main stem, sometimes branching into a Y shape, topped with tiny sporangia, little capsules filled with spores. That was its entire design. No complicated root systems, no broad leaves, just enough plumbing to move water upward and sprinkle spores outward. It was, essentially, nature's first prototype of a plant. Early, clumsy, and not particularly impressive. What was Cooksonia used for? Absolutely nothing. By the time humans arrived, it had been extinct for hundreds of millions of years. You couldn't eat it. You couldn't build with it. You couldn't even lean on it, because it would snap immediately. The only creatures that might have benefited from Cooksonia were tiny invertebrates, who may have used it as shade, assuming a stick 3 centimeters tall provides shade. Beyond that, Cooksonia existed simply because evolution had to start somewhere. Despite its underwhelming appearance, Cooksonia is famous in paleobotany circles, not because it was exciting, but because it represented a turning point. Before Cooksonia, plants were mostly confined to water. With Cooksonia, the game officially moved onto land. In other words, it was groundbreaking, in the most boring way imaginable. If you walked through a Silurian landscape, you'd see little else besides Cooksonia. A field of green pins sticking out of mud, not exactly a postcard-worthy scene. Still, paleontologists get excited about its fossils, often preserved as simple outlines on rocks. To the trained eye, these faint lines are thrilling evidence of one of the dullest milestones in natural history. Cooksonia's legacy is not beauty, usefulness, or even endurance. Its legacy is that it showed plants could survive out of water. After that, other plants came along and quickly did the same thing, only better. Cooksonia faded away, remembered only by specialists and now by you. From the absurdly large to the laughably small, our journey continues. Next, we'll look at one of the earliest trees to actually resemble a tree, Archaeopteris. It finally managed wood and branches, but, as you'll soon learn, still found a way to disappoint. After the mystery logs of Prototaxites and the tiny green sticks of Cooksonia, we finally arrive at something that almost looks like a tree. Try to contain your excitement. Archaeopteris lived about 380 million years ago during the Devonian period, and is often called the world's first modern tree. At last, branches, wood, and leaves, the full package. It stood tall, with a respectable canopy, and it gave Earth its very first forests. In short, it looked like the kind of tree you might actually recognize, if you squinted. But before you get too impressed, remember, this is still the boring files. Archaeopteris might have been the first tree, but it was also, in many ways, a flop. It went extinct long before humans ever thought about turning trees into tables, boats, or baseball bats. All that wood, and no one around to carve it. Evolution's version of building IKEA furniture, then throwing it straight in the landfill. The tree had fern-like leaves, short branches, and a woody trunk. Scientists get excited about its vascular system, which is essentially the plant equivalent of plumbing. Archaeopteryx was good at moving water and nutrients, which helped it grow tall and dominate landscapes. But if you were a Devonian animal, your options with Archaeopteryx were limited. You couldn't eat fruit, it didn't make any. You couldn't chew leaves, too tough. You couldn't even climb it unless you were an insect, because vertebrates hadn't quite gotten around to evolving that skill yet. So what was it used for? Shade, possibly. Archaeopteryx may have cooled swampy environments, giving amphibians a place to lurk without drying out. It may also have played a role in changing Earth's atmosphere, producing oxygen at levels that allowed larger animals to eventually thrive. That's a big contribution, though done in such a low-key, unintentional way that it feels like it doesn't count. It's like someone falling asleep on the light switch and accidentally improving the planet. Its extinction was not a dramatic event. Archaeopteryx spread across the globe, filled the Devonian with forests, and then disappeared by the early Carboniferous, replaced by other trees that were better adapted. If you've ever been out-competed at work by someone slightly more competent, you know how Archaeopteryx felt. Still, scientists give it credit as a pioneer. The problem with pioneers is that nobody remembers them once the more polished versions come along. Archaeopteryx is the beta release of trees, full of bugs, clunky design, but technically functional. It showed what trees could be, then vanished before anyone could say thank you. And while Archaeopteryx may have been important in shaping early ecosystems, today it exists mostly as a curiosity in paleobotany textbooks and museum labels that visitors skim over on their way to the dinosaurs. From trees that almost mattered, we now turn to something far less ambitious, a seed fern with dull leaves. It's called Glossopteris, and while it wasn't exciting at the time, it accidentally became famous for something scientists cared about millions of years later. Glossopteris was a seed fern that lived during the Permian period, about 250 to 300 million years ago. If you've never heard of seed ferns, don't worry. Most people haven't, and most who have wish they hadn't. Glossopteris was defined by its leaves, long, tongue-shaped, and incredibly repetitive. Entire landscapes were covered with them, creating what must have been one of the dullest forests in history. On the surface, Glossopteris doesn't sound like a headliner. It didn't tower to extraordinary heights like Prototaxites, and it didn't break new ground like Cooksonia. It was simply everywhere. Vast plains of identical leaves spreading across what was then the supercontinent Gondwana. Imagine walking through an endless fern wallpaper, flat, green, and uninspired. And yet, Glossopteris became unexpectedly famous, not because of what it was, but because of where it was found. Fossils of Glossopteris have turned up on multiple continents: South America, Africa, India, Antarctica, and Australia. This puzzled early scientists. How could the same boring plant appear in places separated by oceans? The answer, of course, was continental drift, the realization that all those continents were once connected. In other words, Glossopteris accidentally became Exhibit A in proving that the ground beneath our feet moves around. So while dinosaurs got to inspire wonder and mammoths inspired cave paintings, Glossopteris's big contribution was forcing geologists to accept that Earth's land masses play a slow-motion game of bumper cars. That's its legacy. Not beauty, not usefulness, just being geographically inconvenient enough to change the course of science. For the plant itself, life was unremarkable. It spread widely, produced seeds in little cupules attached to its leaves and formed entire ecosystems dominated by its own monotony. When the Permian extinction rolled around, the so-called Great Dying that wiped out most life on Earth, Glossopteris went with it. And although entire continents had once been carpeted in its leaves, the world moved on without so much as a sigh. Today, fossils of Glossopteris show up in museums and geology textbooks. To the casual observer, they look like rock slabs stamped with elongated ovals. To paleobotanists, they are evidence of Earth's shifting crust. To everyone else, they are frankly a nap waiting to happen. From the plant that accidentally proved the continent's move, we turn back to the swamp forests of the Carboniferous. Here another tall, scaly tree was waiting its turn in the spotlight. Lepidodendron, sometimes called the scale tree. Spoiler, it was just as dull as it sounds. Lepidodendron was a tree of the Carboniferous swamps about 300 million years ago. The name means scale tree, and predictably, it got this name because its bark looked like scales. Imagine a giant reptile stretched into the shape of a tree, but without any of the excitement that description suggests. These trees could grow up to 30 or even 40 meters tall, as high as a modern 10-story building. They dominated entire swamp forests, standing shoulder to shoulder like a crowd of rigid green poles. If you've ever walked through a pine plantation where every tree looks exactly the same, you have some idea of the visual thrill Lepidodendron offered, only taller and damper. Structurally, it wasn't what we'd call a tree today. Lepidodendron had no true wood inside. Instead, its trunk was hollow and filled with soft tissue, which meant that once it died, it collapsed quickly. Not much chance of fossilized furniture here. Its claim to fame was its distinctive diamond-patterned bark, left behind as impressions in stone. To the untrained eye, those fossils looked like someone pressed a chain-link fence into a rock. Reproduction was handled with cones filled with spores. Lepidodendron didn't bother with seeds, flowers, or fruit. Just spores, launched into the swampy air like prehistoric dust. Forests of lepidodendrons spread this way, vast and monotonous. It was a successful strategy, but one that offered very little variety. So what was it used for? In a direct sense, nothing. Humans never saw it. No animals built nests in it. No birds sang in its branches, mostly because birds did not exist yet. But indirectly, Lepidodendron had one lasting effect. Like many carboniferous plants, when it died and fell into swamp water, it failed to decay fully. Over millions of years, the compressed remains of Lepidodendron became coal. That's right. The very fuel that powered the Industrial Revolution was in large part Lepidodendron's one big encore. Not because it wanted to, of course, just because it was bad at decomposing. So, in a sense, every train that ran, every factory that roared, and every fireplace that burned coal owes a quiet thanks to Lepidodendron. Though to be fair, no one actually thanks it, because it was just a giant plant that collapsed into muck. Today, Lepidodendron fossils appear in geology collections around the world. Most are bark impressions, repetitive and unremarkable. Students dutifully memorize the name, paleobotanists dutifully publish papers on it, and everyone else dutifully forgets it as soon as possible. But Lepidodendron was not alone. Sharing the same swampy landscapes was another tall, diamond-patterned, spore-shedding pole, Sigillaria. You'll be forgiven if the two sound indistinguishable, because they nearly were. If Lepidodendron was the scale tree, then Sigillaria was its equally uninspiring cousin. Both lived during the Carboniferous period, both grew tall in the swamp forests, and both ended up as coal. If you're starting to sense a theme here, that's because there was one. The Carboniferous was less a time of innovation and more a time of tall plants falling over into bogs. Sigillaria could reach heights of about 20 to 30 meters, though in fairness, it wasn't quite as grand as Lepidodendron. Its main distinguishing feature was the pattern on its trunk. Where Lepidodendron had diamond-shaped leaf scars, Sigillaria opted for vertical rows of elongated oval scars. That's it. That was the difference. Diamond versus oval. Not exactly the stuff of blockbuster documentaries. The plant itself looked like a giant pole, topped with a small tuft of leaves. Imagine a narrow palm tree that forgot to grow coconuts. Its crown of leaves was unimpressive. Its reproductive strategy was the same old spore game, and its woodless trunk meant it collapsed almost as soon as it died. Some forests were almost entirely Sigillaria, fields of vertical, boring repetition, destined to rot in unison. Its role in the ecosystem was functional, if not glamorous. Sigillaria, like Lepidodendron, was part of the dense vegetation that altered Earth's atmosphere, pumping oxygen into the air and shaping conditions for giant insects and amphibians. That sounds dramatic, but remember, it didn't mean Sigillaria was trying to change the world. It was simply standing there, photosynthesizing. Its greatest impact was accidental. For paleobotanists, Sigillaria is notable because its fossils are so common. Large slabs of rock often preserve its vertical scar patterns, which look to the casual observer like someone dragged a comb across the surface. You might walk right past a fossil of Sigillaria without realizing it, unless someone had labeled it in large, helpful letters. Even then, you'd probably keep walking. As for human use, Sigillaria followed the Carboniferous tradition. It became coal, countless tons of it. If you ever burned coal for heat, you may have been enjoying a bit of Sigillaria without realizing it. Not exactly the glamorous afterlife plants usually dream of, but consistent. In many ways, Sigillaria is a perfect symbol of the Carboniferous, tall, repetitive, and destined to end up underground. Its story is not exciting, it is not emotional, it is not even especially different from its cousin. But it is, at the very least, another step on our sleepy journey through the most uninspiring plants Earth has ever produced. From the scaled trees and scarred trunks of Lepidodendron and Sigillaria, we move to something a little different, but only slightly. Our next stop is calamites, a plant that looked suspiciously like a horsetail, if a horsetail had decided to grow as tall as a telephone pole. Calamites were relatives of modern horsetails, but instead of being small, delicate plants growing near streams, they decided to scale up dramatically. In the swamp forests of the Carboniferous, calamites often grew 10 to 20 meters tall, about the size of a telephone pole. Imagine walking into a marsh and being surrounded by horsetails the height of buildings. It was less forest and more field of giant hollow straws. Their structure was remarkably simple. Calamites had segmented stems, just like modern horsetails, with hollow centers and a repeating pattern of nodes. They reproduced with cones that released spores, because apparently every plant in the Carboniferous signed up for the same reproductive strategy. Their leaves were long and narrow, spiraling in whorls at each joint, giving them a brush-like appearance. To modern eyes, they look less like trees and more like nature's attempt at plumbing equipment. As with Lepidodendron and Sigillaria, calamites lacked true wood. Their strength came from a thick outer rind, while the inside was mostly hollow. When alive, this was fine. When dead, it meant they collapsed into soggy piles almost immediately. Fossils of calamites often preserve the ribbed texture of their outer walls, which look suspiciously like bamboo. Some fossil collectors even mistake them for petrified bamboo, until a paleobotanist corrects them, usually with great enthusiasm, and usually to an audience that regrets asking. What was their role? Like the other swamp trees, they helped fill vast lowland environments with vegetation, locking up carbon and producing oxygen. In fact, the sheer biomass of calamites and their neighbours may have contributed to the Carboniferous having unusually high oxygen levels, enough for dragonflies with 2-foot wingspans and millipedes the size of alligators to exist. So, indirectly, you can thank calamites for making bugs terrifying. But as a plant in itself, calamites was unremarkable. It didn't bear fruit, didn't produce seeds, and didn't even stick around all that long compared to some of its contemporaries. When conditions shifted and the swamps dried, calamites largely vanished, remembered mostly as yet another contributor to coal seams. If there's one lesson to take from the Carboniferous so far, it's that the quickest way for a plant to secure immortality was to fall into a swamp and rot inefficiently. Today, calamites fossils are common in collections, often appearing as long, ribbed impressions or casts of their hollow stems. To most people, they look like stone segments of PVC pipe. To paleobotanists, they're a reminder of a time when horsetails briefly had ambitions, grew too tall, and then quietly retired from being trees forever. From towering horsetails, our story turns to something that at least tried to look a little more decorative. Ceronius, the next entry, was a tree fern with sprawling roots, often described as the Carboniferous version of a houseplant, only scaled up to the size of a building. Ceronius was a tree fern of the late Carboniferous and Permian, reaching heights of 10 to 15 meters. In other words, it was essentially the world's largest houseplant. If you've ever had a fern in your living room that grew out of control, now imagine one the size of a small apartment building. That was Ceronius. Structurally, it was odd. Instead of a solid woody trunk, Ceronius was supported by a dense mat of roots that wrapped around a soft inner core. This gave it a thick, shaggy appearance, like a mop standing upright. The crown at the top sprouted massive fronds that spread outward, creating shade beneath. It was, by all accounts, one of the more elegant plants of its time, though that isn't saying much, given the competition was mostly poles, cones, and more poles. The roots of Ceronius formed miniature ecosystems of their own. Smaller plants and animals lived among the tangled masses at its base, making it something like a prehistoric apartment complex. That sounds impressive until you realize the tenants were mostly mosses, fungi, and insects. Not exactly bustling city life, but it was a start. Reproduction followed the classic fern model: spores, millions of tiny particles released into the swamp air, floating off to hopefully land in a damp, favorable patch of soil. If this sounds repetitive, it's because nearly every plant of the Carboniferous relied on the same strategy. Diversity was not the strong suit of that era. Ceronius managed to survive longer than some of its swampy neighbours, persisting into the Permian, before finally fading away. By then, seed-bearing plants were gaining ground, offering more efficient ways to reproduce. Once seeds became fashionable, spores started to look outdated. Ceronius, unable to keep up with the trend, quietly left the stage. Fossils of Ceronius are common, especially its roots, which preserved well in stone. Paleobotanists admire these fossils, sometimes slicing them into cross-sections to reveal their intricate patterns. To the casual viewer, they look like decorative coasters. To scientists, they are evidence of one of the last great spore-producing giants. To everyone else, they are an excellent reason to yawn. Ceronius's contribution was modest but steady. It provided shade, added biomass, and eventually, like most of its peers, contributed to coal deposits. In other words, it lived large, died quietly, and was later shoveled into steam engines. A glamorous legacy if you measure glamour in kilowatts. From the shaggy trunks of tree ferns, we move on to something stranger still. Early trees with hollow, pipe-like structures inside them. Cladoxylopsids were complex on the inside, but, as you'll see, still managed to accomplish almost nothing. Cladoxylopsids were among the earliest attempts at trees, appearing during the Devonian period, over 380 million years ago. On the outside, they looked fairly standard. Tall, upright trunks with frond-like branches at the top. From a distance, you might have mistaken them for palm trees. Up close, however, they were a structural nightmare. Instead of having a solid trunk, Cladoxylopsids were hollow in the middle and filled with dozens, sometimes hundreds, of little vascular strands arranged around the edges. Each strand acted like its own miniature pipe, carrying water and nutrients. Imagine a bundle of straws taped together into the shape of a cylinder, then scaled up to tree size. That was the Cladoxylopsid design. This odd setup came with consequences. As the tree grew, the inner strands collapsed and died, while the outer ones kept expanding. The result was a tree trunk that essentially hollowed itself out from the inside. It survived by continuously patching new pipes around the perimeter. To modern engineers, this sounds less like a tree and more like a poorly maintained water main. What did Cladoxylopsids accomplish with this complexity? Not much. They grew tall, provided shade, and eventually fell over like every other plant of their time. They didn't produce seeds, didn't invent flowers, and didn't really evolve into anything that lasted. Their big claim to fame is confusing paleobotanists who have spent decades trying to figure out how such a ridiculous system could have worked. It did work, technically, just not for very long in evolutionary terms. Fossils of Cladoxylopsids are fairly common, showing cross-sections that look suspiciously like honeycombs or bundles of drinking straws. To a trained scientist, they are fascinating insights into early plant anatomy. To everyone else, they look like someone pressed a bundle of cables into rock. If you've ever stared at the back of a messy TV stand, you've essentially experienced Cladoxylopsid architecture. And as usual, they weren't useful to humans. By the time people arrived, Cladoxylopsids had been gone for hundreds of millions of years. No lumber, no firewood, no carving material. Just hollow, complicated sticks that became fossils no one outside of academia really cares about. Still, Cladoxylopsids deserve a moment of recognition. They represent one of nature's earliest experiments in building tall plants, even if the design was more convoluted than effective. Evolution moved on, producing sturdier and more practical trees, while the Cladoxylopsids faded quietly into history. From hollow trunks stuffed with pipes, we move to something a little more familiar. Chordates were early relatives of conifers, trees that at least started to look like the forests we know today. Unfortunately, they were every bit as forgettable as the plants we've already covered. Chordates were tall, spindly trees that appeared in the late Carboniferous and Permian periods, and they are generally considered distant relatives of modern conifers. When you hear that, you might imagine something noble and picturesque, like a pine forest blanketed in snow. The reality was far less poetic. Chordates grew in swampy lowlands, produced long, leathery leaves, and generally looked like a patchy prehistoric version of evergreens. In short, the knockoff brand of pine trees. The trunks of chordates were slim compared to their height, sometimes stretching up to 30 meters tall, but lacking the bulk of sturdier trees. They often grew in dense stands, but instead of producing the cozy fragrance we associate with modern pines, they left behind an impression of long, flat foliage that resembled strips of cardboard. Fossils of their leaves are among the most common finds from the period, which means if you've ever seen a rock with a long, boring leaf imprint, you may have already encountered chordates and probably didn't remember it. Chordates reproduced with seeds, which was a step up from the endless spore cloud strategy favored by their swamp-dwelling neighbors. This meant they were a little more modern, at least in theory. In practice, the seeds weren't particularly remarkable, nor did they lead to any exciting evolutionary innovations. Their big legacy is simply being part of the slow, gradual march toward the forests we recognize today. Some species of chordates preferred dry ground, while others adapted to swampy habitats. Paleobotanists spend a great deal of time categorizing these differences, which is an impressive level of dedication for something that most people would describe as yet another tree. They bore cones, which further connects them to modern conifers, though these cones were small and underwhelming, unlikely to inspire anyone to deck a Christmas tree. In terms of impact, chordates forests did provide habitats for early reptiles and amphibians, offering shade and cover in otherwise open landscapes. But once again, we're stretching the definition of impact. Their true contribution is that they stood around for tens of millions of years, then quietly disappeared, leaving only leaf fossils and the occasional cone imprint. A background actor in Earth's long-running play. Today, chordates live on only in paleontology collections, where slabs of rock are carefully labeled and stored, awaiting visitors who, in many cases, walk straight past them to get to the trilobites or dinosaur bones. In fairness, this is probably the role chordates would have wanted, present, but not drawing attention. So ends the first act of swamp forests, scale trees, horsetails, and early conifers. As we move into the Triassic, plants began experimenting with new designs, though not necessarily more interesting ones. Next up is Dicroidium, a seed fern that tried to distinguish itself with fork-shaped leaves. The results were, predictably, not as exciting as they sound. Dicroidium was a genus of seed ferns that thrived during the Triassic period, particularly in the southern continents that once made up Gondwana. By this point in Earth's history, the great swamp forests of the Carboniferous were long gone, and new plant groups were starting to experiment with more modern features. Dicroidium's big innovation: leaves that split into two. That's it. Fork-shaped foliage. Nature's idea of mixing things up. The name itself comes from the Greek for two forks, which is about as literal as you can get. The leaves branched in a way that made them look vaguely like a tuning fork or a slingshot. For paleobotanists, this was exciting because it made Dicroidium easy to identify in the fossil record. For everyone else, it was just another fern-like plant with a slightly different silhouette. Imagine walking through a forest of ferns and realizing that these ones had forked tips. Would you stop and admire them? Probably not. Dicroidiums spread widely across Gondwana, covering large areas of what is now South America, Africa, India, Antarctica, and Australia. Its success is measured not in excitement, but in abundance. Fossils of its leaves are among the most common Triassic plant impressions in those regions. Entire slabs of rock are filled with them, layered like sheets of prehistoric paperwork. To scientists, this is useful evidence of ancient climates. To the casual observer, it's rock wallpaper. The plant reproduced using seeds rather than spores, which technically makes it more advanced than the swamp giants of earlier periods. But these seeds were small, unremarkable, and unlikely to inspire anyone to snack on them. Dicroidium also grew in varied forms, with some species bearing larger, broader leaves and others producing narrower, finer foliage. Paleobotanists carefully classify these distinctions, though the differences are so subtle that most non-specialists would never notice. Like many plants of its time, Dicroidium eventually disappeared as newer, flashier plant groups took over. Conifers spread and flourished, while flowering plants prepared for their eventual debut millions of years later. Dicroidium, once widespread and dominant, faded quietly, leaving behind its forked leaves as its only memorable feature. In terms of legacy, Dicroidium is useful mostly as a geological marker. Its fossils help scientists date Triassic rocks and reconstruct past climates. In other words, its main role today is to help researchers write papers that almost no one reads. For the rest of the world, Dicroidium is exactly what you'd expect from a plant in the boring files: common, dull, and forgettable. From a seed fern that split its leaves in two, we now turn to another seed fern, one that gets a little more attention simply because it produced some of the earliest seeds recognizable in the fossil record. Next is Ligonopteris, which at least had the courtesy of contributing to the story of how plants figured out reproduction, even if it wasn't particularly exciting while doing it. Ligonopteris was a seed fern from the late Paleozoic, and it has the dubious honor of being one of the first plants to produce seeds that we can clearly identify in the fossil record. That sounds impressive, until you realize what the seeds actually looked like. Small, round structures about the size of a pea, not exactly awe-inspiring. Still, in the slow march of plant evolution, producing peas where before there had only been spores was a step forward. The leaves of Ligonopteris were large and divided into many segments, giving it a fern-like appearance. In fact, that's why seed ferns confuse so many people. They look like ferns, but technically they are not ferns at all. They are gymnosperms, plants that reproduce with naked seeds instead of spores. This made them more advanced than their swampy predecessors, but not by much. Ligonopteris was essentially evolution dipping a toe into the idea of seeds without committing to anything more interesting. Its stems and leaves are commonly found as fossils, often preserved with fine detail. Paleobotanists admire these specimens because they show the anatomy of early seed plants. Everyone else tends to glance at them and think, just another fern. The irony is that Ligonopteris really was a milestone, but it managed to achieve that milestone in the most unmemorable way possible. There is one fossil structure that has given Ligonopteris a bit of extra attention: its seeds, known as lagonostoma. These are so frequently found with Ligonopteris leaves that paleobotanists link them together as part of the same plant. In research papers, this is treated as a significant connection. In practice, it means scientists spent years arguing about which seed went with which fern-looking leaf. Once they figured it out, they promptly moved on to less tedious subjects. In life, Ligonopteris formed part of the understory of late Carboniferous forests, filling in the gaps beneath taller plants like Lepidodendron and Sigillaria. It wasn't dominant, but it was persistent. If you had walked through those swamps, you would have seen it spread out around your feet, yet another layer of greenery in an already overstocked plant world. Its eventual extinction left little impact. Ligonopteris vanished along with many of its seed fern relatives as the world shifted into new climates and new plant groups rose to dominance. The seed experiment, however, lived on and was later adopted with much more success by conifers and flowering plants. So, in a sense, Ligonopteris was a pioneer, though not the kind anyone remembers with fondness. Today, it sits quietly in museum drawers and textbooks, important for specialists, forgettable for everyone else. Its story is one of being first, but not memorable. From one seed fern to another, we move to Medulosa, a plant with enormous fronds that look dramatic in life, but in the end, contributed almost as little as Ligonopteris did. Medulosa was another member of the seed fern group, appearing in the late Carboniferous and Permian periods. If Ligonopteris was the starter pack of seed ferns, Medulosa was the deluxe version. Its fronds were enormous, sometimes stretching several meters in length, spreading outward like oversized feathers. If you're picturing a giant prehistoric fern taking up way too much space in the swamp, you've got the right idea. Its stems were distinctive because they contained a lot of soft tissue surrounded by a ring of vascular strands. This anatomy was unusual, and for a long time it kept paleobotanists debating how exactly Medulosa functioned. To most people, this is not an especially riveting question. But to specialists, the internal anatomy of a fossilized stem is apparently the kind of thing worth writing long academic papers about. The plant's leaves were divided into smaller leaflets, giving it a very lush appearance. In reconstructions, Medulosa looks quite dramatic, more like the kind of plant you'd expect in a tropical greenhouse than in a swamp filled with coal trees. But that's really where its intrigue ends. Beneath all that foliage, it was still just another spore-turned-seed experiment in a long line of plants that tried and failed to hold the spotlight. One of the more curious things about Medulosa is that it produced seeds that were often attached directly to its leaves, rather than being tucked away in cones or separate structures. This has fascinated paleobotanists because it blurs the line between ferns and seed plants even further. To the rest of us, it sounds like nature taped a few peas to the leaves and called it a day. As with many plants of its era, Medulosa eventually succumbed to changing climates. By the end of the Permian, the Earth was entering one of its most catastrophic extinction events, and Medulosa did not make it through. Its massive fronds, once so imposing, were reduced to impressions in rock. Today, those impressions are common in fossil collections, often mistaken for oversized fern leaves until someone points out that they belong to a seed fern, not a true fern. At which point most people politely nod and move on. Medulosa's story is one of scale without substance. It looked impressive, but its ecological contributions were no more remarkable than any of its seed fern cousins. It lived, it spread, it produced seeds in unusual ways, and then it disappeared. leaving little behind besides academic debates and fossils in drawers. And if you think Medulosa was uninspiring, you'll be pleased, or perhaps dismayed, to know that it was only one branch of a much larger group. The next entry isn't a single plant at all, but an entire category, the pteridosperms, or seed ferns in general. If you thought one was enough, prepare yourself for many more, each equally difficult to care about. If you've been waiting for things to get simpler, prepare for disappointment. Pteridosperms are not a single plant, but an entire group, known more broadly as the seed ferns. And if that phrase sounds confusing, that's because it is. Despite the name, they were not true ferns, and despite the word seed, they weren't particularly advanced compared to later plants. The label is really just a convenient bucket for a collection of fern-like plants that produce seeds. In other words, when scientists don't know what else to call something, they invent a category. Seed ferns first appeared in the Devonian and spread widely through the Carboniferous and Permian. They looked like ferns, with large fronds divided into many leaflets, but their reproduction was more like that of gymnosperms, producing naked seeds rather than relying solely on spores. This odd mixture kept them going for a while, but ultimately it was a temporary solution. Nature, as it turned out, was just passing through on its way to inventing conifers and flowering plants. For paleobotanists, pteridosperms are fascinating because they blur lines. For everyone else, they are just endless reconstructions of leafy plants that all look the same. To a museum visitor, one seed fern leaf looks much like another. To a specialist, those small differences, the angle of a leaflet, the shape of a seed structure, are enough to fill conference talks and journal articles. Fossils of pteridosperms are among the most common plant fossils on Earth. They appear as impressions of fronds in shale, often mistaken by casual collectors for modern ferns. Some genera, like Alethopteris and Neuropteris, are household names, though only if your household happens to be a paleobotany lab. For everyone else, the name pteridosperm probably sounds more like a medical condition than a plant group. What was their role in the ecosystem? Mostly as ground cover or mid-level vegetation, filling forests with greenery. They supported insect populations, contributed oxygen, and eventually became coal. That's a resume identical to nearly every other plant of their era. Their big claim to fame today is being so widespread that they help geologists date rock layers. In other words, their main function is serving as the background grid of Earth's history. By the late Permian, seed ferns were already in decline, crowded out by more efficient seed plants like conifers. By the Cretaceous, they were almost entirely gone, remembered mostly by the impressions they left in stone. In paleontology, seed fern is practically synonymous with leaf fossil we haven't fully sorted out yet. So while pteridosperms may represent an entire chapter of plant evolution, they are also the botanical equivalent of filler text, important in theory, but not especially gripping in practice. From the broad category of seed ferns, we now turn to a specific example. Alethopteris was one of the more common varieties, and if you think that means it will be more exciting, I regret to inform you it will not. Alethopteris was one of the more common genera of seed ferns, flourishing during the Carboniferous period. Its fronds were large, compound, and divided into rows of leaflets that looked to modern eyes almost identical to those of living ferns. That resemblance is the main reason Allothopteris continues to confuse casual fossil hunters. At first glance, you'd swear you were looking at a fern pressed neatly into rock, and then a paleobotanist will gently but firmly correct you, explaining that Allothopteris was technically a gymnosperm, not a fern at all. By the time they finish, you'll likely wish you hadn't asked. The fronds of Allothopteris could grow to considerable lengths, forming dense, leafy growths that covered the understory of Carboniferous forests. In reconstructions, they look lush, like enormous ferns spreading across a swampy landscape. In reality, their ecological role was unremarkable. They photosynthesized, provided some habitat for insects, and eventually fell over to become part of the endless, decaying biomass of the coal swamps. If you've noticed a pattern in this series, it's because there is one. Stand tall, make spores or seeds, fall into a swamp, become coal. Allothopteris followed the script precisely. The fossils of Allothopteris are among the most common plant impressions in Carboniferous rock. They're prized by collectors, but not because they're rare. In fact, the opposite. They're abundant, often preserved with crisp detail, making them a frequent first fossil for beginners. Many people proudly display Allothopteris slabs on their shelves, unaware they are showcasing one of the most ordinary plants in Earth's history. One of the only mildly interesting features of Allothopteris is its association with fertile structures, small organs that bore seeds attached to the fronds. This connection helped confirm that it was indeed a seed fern and not a true fern. Scientists got excited about this distinction. Everyone else simply nodded and turned back to the trilobites. Allothopteris went extinct with the decline of the seed ferns toward the end of the Paleozoic. It did not survive into later eras, leaving behind no direct descendants. Its only enduring presence is in the fossil record, where it serves as a marker of the Carboniferous and a reminder that not all common plants are remembered fondly. Some are simply remembered because they were everywhere, like wallpaper in a room no one redecorated for millions of years. And speaking of wallpaper, our next plant fits the description even more closely. Neuropteris was another seed fern that dominated the fossil record with its leaf impressions. To a specialist, the veins of Neuropteris fronds have subtle differences that matter deeply. To the rest of us, they are yet another collection of fern-like patterns pressed into stone, indistinguishable from all the others. Neuropteris was another of the seed ferns that filled Carboniferous forests, and by this point, you may be noticing a trend. If you've seen one seed fern, you've seen them all fern. You've more or less seen them all. Still, paleobotanists insist that Neuropteris deserves its own category, largely because its leaf veins are a little different. That's right. The great distinction between Allothopteris and Neuropteris boils down to the angle of the veins in their leaves. For most people, that difference is invisible. For scientists, it's a publishable paper. Neuropteris fronds were large, divided into many leaflets, and grew in graceful arches. To the eye, they resembled modern maidenhair ferns, only on a larger scale. Fossil slabs often preserve these fronds with delicate detail, the veins clearly etched into the stone. Visitors at museums sometimes admire them for their beauty, before realizing they're looking at what amounts to prehistoric wallpaper. Like Allothopteris, Neuropteris was abundant. Its fossils turn up in coal seams all over the world. Collectors often find them because they are so common, and they make attractive pieces for display. but abundance doesn't equal excitement. Neuropteris was the sort of plant that blended into the background of its ecosystem. Plenty of it, none of it remarkable. Think of it as the dandelion of the Carboniferous, except bigger, leafier, and destined to end up as coal instead of lawn clippings. The plant reproduced using seeds, like other seed ferns, and its fertile structures have been carefully catalogued. This has given researchers useful data about how early seed plants spread and evolved. But for the average person, fertile structures sound less like a discovery and more like a detail best left out of polite conversation. Ecologically, Neuropteris filled the understory, forming thickets that probably made swamp travel miserable for any animal trying to walk through. Dense, tangled, and leafy, not unlike fighting your way through overgrown weeds in a modern marsh, only with dragonflies the size of hawks buzzing overhead. That was Neuropteris' great contribution, making Carboniferous swamps even more inconvenient. Eventually, like most seed ferns, Neuropteris faded away with the rise of more advanced plants. Its name lingers because its fossils are everywhere, but its influence stopped the moment climates shifted and conifers took over. It had its time, it filled its niche, and then it vanished without ceremony. If you find yourself underwhelmed by Neuropteris, you're not alone. Even among paleobotanists, it tends to play second fiddle to more distinctive genera. Its role today is to fill drawers in geology departments and to make fossil collectors say, "Ah yes, another Neuropteris," with all the enthusiasm of someone finding a spare paperclip. From the broad fronds of Neuropteris, we now move to something smaller and less imposing. Sphenophyllum was a relative of horsetails, but unlike calamites, it never tried to grow to the size of a telephone pole. Instead, it stayed modest, a wedge-leaved plant that barely stood out even when it was alive. Sphenophyllum was a small plant that lived from the late Devonian through the Permian, and it was distantly related to horsetails. If calamites were the show-offs of the horsetail family, growing into towering hollow poles, Sphenophyllum was the quiet relative who never left the corner of the room. It rarely grew taller than a meter, often much less, which in the Carboniferous made it the botanical equivalent of background noise. Its most distinctive feature was its wedge-shaped leaves. In fact, its name literally means wedge leaf. The leaves were arranged in whorls around the stem, radiating out like spokes on a wheel. Each leaf tapered to a point, giving the plant a starburst look when viewed from above. Paleobotanists have spent a great deal of time describing the exact angle of those wedges, which, while technically important, may not be the most thrilling use of anyone's time. Sphenophyllum likely grew along the ground, or as an understory plant, creeping through the shadows of much larger neighbours. It was not tall enough to provide shade, not strong enough to support animals, and not nutritious enough to excite herbivores. Its ecological role was modest. It filled space. Think of it as the filler track on an album. Not a hit, but technically still part of the record. Its reproduction was spore-based, which by now should surprise no one. It produced small cones filled with spores that drifted into the air, and with luck, landed somewhere suitable. If this sounds repetitive, that's because almost every plant we've covered so far relied on the same approach. The Carboniferous was not an era known for imaginative reproduction. Fossils of Sphenophyllum are common, especially the distinctive wedge-shaped leaves, which preserve well in fine-grained rock. To fossil collectors, they are recognizable, but not particularly sought after. To paleobotanists, they are another useful data point for reconstructing ancient ecosystems. To the rest of us, they are one more leaf imprint that looks remarkably like all the others. Sphenophyllum managed to survive for tens of millions of years before eventually fading out. Unlike some of its taller relatives, it never tried to dominate landscapes or grow to absurd sizes. It stuck to being small, simple, and thoroughly unremarkable. Perhaps that's why it lasted so long. No ambition, no overreach, just steady, quiet existence until it wasn't there anymore. In the end, Sphenophyllum's greatest legacy is reminding us that not every extinct plant was a giant or a pioneer. Some were simply there, growing quietly in the shadows, contributing little beyond ground cover, and leaving behind fossils that only specialists get excited about. From the small and modest, we move back to something that at least tried to look like a tree. Cyclostigma was another early attempt at being tall, but as we'll see, ambition didn't necessarily lead to success. Cyclostigma was one of the Devonian's many early experiments with tree life. If you've been keeping track, you'll notice that the Devonian seems to have been a period where evolution repeatedly asked the same question: what if we made a tree? Cyclostigma was one of the answers, though not a very satisfying one. It stood upright, grew several meters tall, and then, well, that was about it. The name means circle mark, a reference to the round leaf scars that dotted its trunk. These circular scars were left behind when its narrow leaves fell away, creating a patterned surface that paleobotanists can easily identify. To the untrained eye, however, a cyclostigma trunk just looks like a stick with spots, which is admittedly not the most exciting legacy. Structurally, cyclostigma wasn't especially impressive. Its trunk was slender and its branches minimal, giving it a spindly, awkward look. Reconstructions usually show it as a tall pole with tufts of leaves near the top, which does not exactly scream majestic. If anything, it resembled a badly assembled model of a tree, the kind of thing you'd return to the store because the instructions were missing. Cyclostigma's big contribution to paleobotany is simply existing at the right time. It was one of the earliest arborescent lycopsids, in plain English, a club moss that tried to play the role of a tree. In doing so, it helped pave the way for the much larger lycopsid trees of the Carboniferous, like Lepidodendron and Sigillaria. So in a sense, cyclostigma was a rehearsal, a practice run for plants that actually managed to dominate ecosystems later. Unfortunately, like many rehearsals, it wasn't very memorable. Fossils of cyclostigma show up in Devonian rocks, usually as imprints of stems or cross-sections of those circular scars. They are scientifically useful because they help date the rocks they're found in, but beyond that, they don't draw much attention. If you stumbled upon one in a fossil collection, you'd likely assume it was part of something more interesting, only to be told, no, that's the whole thing. Its extinction wasn't sudden or dramatic. Cyclostigma simply disappeared as newer, taller, more stable tree forms took over. It didn't leave behind descendants, and it didn't shape ecosystems in any major way. It was a tree-shaped placeholder, filling space until better designs came along. In modern times, cyclostigma is remembered mostly in academic texts, often mentioned briefly before moving on to more successful plants. Its role is minor, its impact negligible, and its name largely unknown outside specialist circles. A tree that tried, failed, and was politely forgotten. From this tree-shaped rehearsal, we move back to a plant that actually made a small name for itself, or at least several names. Archaeopteris physalis was a variation of the first great tree, and while its differences were subtle, they were apparently enough to warrant its own spot in the paleobotany roll call. By now we've already met Archaeopteris, the so-called first modern tree. Archaeopteris physalis was one of its close relatives, so close in fact that many people wonder why it even gets its own name. The answer is simple. Scientists love splitting hairs. Archaeopteris physalis had leaves that divided more readily than the standard version, which is why the species name means split. In practical terms, this difference is about as thrilling as choosing between two nearly identical shades of beige paint. Like its better-known cousin, Archaeopteris physalis had a woody trunk, branches, and fern-like foliage. It grew tall and formed forests, making it part of the great Devonian greening of the continents. Its anatomy shows us that by this point in Earth's history, plants had mastered the basics of being trees. The problem, of course, is that it still didn't do anything interesting with that mastery. No flowers, no fruit, no dramatic survival story, just more branches, more leaves, and then eventual extinction. Fossils of Archaeopteris physalis are preserved in many Devonian rock layers, often as leaf impressions. Paleobotanists examine these with great care, pointing out the subtle distinctions between physalis and other Archaeopteris species. To the rest of us, it all looks exactly the same. A fern-like leaf pressed into stone. One can only imagine the disappointment of a fossil collector who realizes they haven't found anything new, but merely another variation of a tree they already had. In terms of ecological role, Archaeopteris physalis was much like the original Archaeopteris. It dominated landscapes, created shade, and altered soil conditions. It was successful for millions of years, which is impressive in the abstract, but not in the details. Its extinction, like so many plants of its time, came when climates shifted and newer tree groups rose to prominence. There was no dramatic finale, just quiet replacement. The reason Archaeopteris physalis shows up in textbooks is less about its uniqueness and more about paleobotany's obsession with naming things. Every variation, no matter how small, tends to get its own label. For the scientific record, this is important. For storytelling purposes, it is less so. It's like keeping a separate biography for every cousin in a very large family, technically thorough, but exhausting for everyone else. Today, Archaeopteris physalis enjoys the same fate as most seed ferns and early trees, sitting in museum drawers, carefully labelled, studied by specialists, and ignored by nearly everyone else. Its story is not one of drama but of paperwork, another entry in the long catalogue of plants that once existed. From this barely distinguishable species, we broaden our view to the family it belonged to. Archaeopteridaceae was the entire clan of Archaeopteris-like trees. If you think one was underwhelming, wait until you hear about the whole group. Archaeopteridaceae was not a single plant, but an entire family of early trees that lived during the Devonian and Carboniferous periods. If Archaeopteris was the first modern tree, then Archaeopteridaceae was the extended family reunion. Imagine a gathering where every relative looks more or less the same, argues about minor differences, and then disappears without anyone noticing. That, in essence, was the Archaeopteridaceae clan. Members of this family shared the basic characteristics we already saw in Archaeopteris. woody trunks, branching crowns, and fern-like leaves. They were pioneers in creating true forests, covering large parts of the continents and transforming barren landscapes into leafy green ones. From a distance, this may have looked impressive. Up close, however, it was just a lot of identical trees doing very little besides standing around. The leaves of Archaeopterydaceae were small and flat, arranged along branches in a way that gave them a feathery appearance. Fossil slabs of these leaves are common in Devonian deposits, and to paleobotanists, they are crucial for identifying the group. To most people, though, they look like every other leaf impression from this era. If you line them up side by side with Alethopteris, Neuropteris, or any other seed fern, only an expert could tell the difference, and even then, not without squinting. Ecologically, Archaeopterydaceae trees played an important role in stabilizing soils and altering the atmosphere. Their deep root systems helped break down rock and form the first true forest floors, while their massive leaf litter contributed to the build-up of organic material. In other words, they were important, but not exactly charismatic. Their contribution was like that of background staff at an event, essential to keeping things running, but not the ones anyone came to see. The family eventually went extinct as newer groups of trees, like conifers, emerged in the Carboniferous. By then, Archaeopterydaceae had already done the heavy lifting of turning rocky ground into fertile soil, essentially preparing the world for plants that would overshadow them. Their final act was to quietly exit the stage, leaving behind fossil leaves and trunks that specialists still pore over today. In textbooks, Archaeopterydaceae gets a few paragraphs, usually right before the section on the rise of gymnosperms. It serves as a kind of footnote in the grand story of plant evolution, important for what it represented, not for what it achieved. A family of trees that built the stage, but didn't get to star in the play. And so with Archaeopterydaceae, we leave behind the pioneering forest trees and return once more to the swamps of the Carboniferous. There, we encounter not entire families, but the cones of a single, already boring plant. Sigillario strobus was exactly what it sounds like, the cones of Sigillaria, preserved in rock and somehow deserving of its own name. Sigillaria strobus may sound exotic, but it was simply the cone of Sigillaria. Yes, the same Sigillaria we already covered, the tall, scarred tree pole of the Carboniferous. Apparently, paleobotanists decided that the cones deserved their own name, perhaps to make the field sound more complicated, or perhaps because even they got bored of saying the cones of Sigillaria over and over again. Either way, Sigillario strobus was not a new plant, just a piece of one. The cones were long, narrow structures, hanging from the plant's branches and packed with spore-bearing organs. Their job was simple: release spores into the swampy air. Fossils of Sigillario strobus often appear as elongated impressions, sometimes with faint patterns showing where the spore cases once sat. To a trained eye, these are distinct and meaningful. To an untrained eye, they look like lines on a rock. What makes Sigillario strobus noteworthy, if noteworthy is the right word, is that it was one of the more common reproductive structures of the Carboniferous. Coal seams and shale layers are littered with their impressions, which means paleobotanists can reconstruct how these cones grew and functioned. For scientists, that's exciting. For everyone else, it's evidence that even in paleontology, paperwork is unavoidable. If you're wondering what Sigillario strobus was used for, the answer is nothing. Humans never saw it, and animals of the time probably didn't think much of it either. Its entire existence revolved around dropping spores into the environment, a strategy so widespread in the Carboniferous that it's tempting to think every plant was attending the same reproductive seminar. Still, Sigillaria strobus is important in the sense that it helps paleobotanists connect the dots between plant parts. Fossils are often found in pieces, trunks here, leaves there, cones somewhere else. By giving each part its own name, scientists can catalogue them and later reassemble the puzzle. From a technical perspective, this makes sense. From a storytelling perspective, it's like giving separate names to a car, its tires, and its hubcaps. In reconstructions, Sigillario strobus doesn't add much visual interest. A Sigillaria with cones attached looks nearly identical to a Sigillaria without cones. It's the botanical equivalent of accessorizing with something no one notices. Yet, for the sake of accuracy, we give it its moment here, even if it is one of the least exciting entries in an already monotonous lineup. And with that, we move from one cone to another. Our next subject is Calamostachys, the cones of calamites, those giant horsetail poles of the swamp. If you're starting to feel like every plant in the Carboniferous was just a trunk with spores attached, that's because they were. If Sigillario strobus was the cone of Sigillaria, then Calamostachys was the cone of calamites. Once again, we are not dealing with a new plant, but with a part of one that scientists felt compelled to name separately. This was not because the cones were exciting, but because paleobotanists need to organize their collections somehow, and cone from a giant swamp horsetail apparently didn't look dignified in journals. Calamostachys cones grew at the tips of calamites' branches and were made up of tightly packed scales, each holding clusters of spore-producing organs. Their job was the same as every other cone of the Carboniferous: release spores and hope the wind carried them somewhere damp enough to grow. It was not a glamorous lifestyle. If anything, it was the plant equivalent of stuffing envelopes and hoping someone reads the contents. Fossils of Calamostachys are common, usually preserved as slender, cone-shaped impressions in shale. To paleobotanists, these are valuable because they confirm how calamites reproduced. To most observers, they look like blurry pine cones stamped into rock. Museum displays sometimes include them, labeled with great care, and visitors inevitably move on to the dinosaurs within seconds. The cones themselves were relatively small compared to the towering size of the plant. Imagine a tree the height of a building, topped with reproductive structures the size of your hand. It's a little underwhelming, but it was enough to keep the population going for millions of years. Still, as with Sigillario strobus, there was nothing particularly innovative here. Cones filled with spores were the standard issue across most swamp plants of the era. Calamostachys has at least earned paleobotanists' appreciation for providing clear fossils. Unlike some plant parts that crumble into unrecognizable fragments, these cones often preserve fine detail, which allows researchers to reconstruct their anatomy in satisfying precision. Of course, the level of excitement that detail generates depends on your tolerance for long descriptions of cone scales. For many, it's about as gripping as reading a manual for a filing cabinet. Eventually, calamites and its cones declined, along with the Carboniferous swamps that had supported them. As climates dried and seed plants gained the upper hand, spore-reliant strategies like Callimostakis were left behind. Today, the cones rest in slabs of shale, their role in plant history completed, their legacy limited to technical diagrams and dusty drawers. And if cones from horsetails don't excite you, brace yourself. Next comes Archaeocalamites, an even older horsetail relative. It looked almost identical to Calamites, only smaller and earlier. If this feels repetitive, that's because it is. Welcome to paleobotany. Archaeocalamites was an early relative of the Calamites, the giant horsetails of the Carboniferous. As its name suggests, this was the Archaeo, or older version. It appeared in the late Devonian and lived into the early Carboniferous, before its bigger and slightly more successful cousins took over. If Calamites were the tall, ambitious siblings, Archaeocalamites was the quieter older brother who never moved out of the house. Structurally, it looked very much like Calamites. Hollow stems, jointed segments, narrow leaves arranged in whorls, and cones at the tips for releasing spores. The main difference was size. Archaeocalamites didn't reach the telephone pole proportions of Calamites. It was shorter, less dramatic, and generally less imposing. Imagine a world where horsetails were still experimenting with the concept of being tall, but hadn't quite committed yet. Its stems were ribbed, with distinct nodes where leaves attached, and fossils often preserve these as impressions in sandstone and shale. Paleobotanists spend time distinguishing Archaeocalamites fossils from those of later horsetails, which is not always easy, since they look so similar. For the casual observer, it's basically a matter of whether the fossilized stick looks slightly shorter or slightly taller. Hardly the kind of distinction that sets pulses racing. Like its relatives, Archaeocalamites relied on spores for reproduction, releasing countless microscopic particles into the environment. This was an efficient enough strategy for its time, though it eventually fell out of fashion as seed-bearing plants began to dominate. The world was changing, and spore clouds were starting to look outdated. Despite its modest stature, Archaeocalamites did play a role in shaping the wetlands of the late Devonian and early Carboniferous. It grew in dense stands, filling low-lying areas and adding to the biomass that, over time, contributed to coal deposits. This is becoming a recurring theme, and with good reason. Most large plants of the Carboniferous ended up as coal. Archaeocalamites simply got a head start on the process. Its extinction was quiet. As taller, more robust plants like Calamites appeared, Archaeocalamites faded into the background. It was not wiped out by catastrophe, nor did it leave behind any descendants that carried its name into modern times. It simply stopped being competitive and disappeared, a plant whose main distinction was being earlier. Today, its fossils are useful to paleobotanists who want to reconstruct the evolutionary path of horsetails. For everyone else, they are indistinguishable from a stack of other jointed plant fossils. Archaeocalamites may have been first, but being first doesn't always mean being remembered. From this early horsetail, we move to something even smaller and simpler, one of the first vascular plants ever to exist. Rhynia, a plant that looked like little more than a green pipe cleaner, will show us just how unimpressive early land plants could really be. Rhynia is one of those plants that shows up in textbooks more often than it shows up in conversation, which is probably for the best. It lived during the Devonian period, around 400 million years ago, and is considered one of the earliest vascular plants. That means it had tubes to move water and nutrients, a feature that seems basic now, but was revolutionary at the time. Unfortunately, the plant itself didn't look revolutionary. It looked like green pipe cleaners stuck upright in mud. The stems of Rhynia were simple, leafless, and only a few centimeters tall. At the tips, they bore sporangia, little capsules filled with spores. That was the entirety of the design. No roots, no branches, no leaves, just tubes with spore capsules. If you were expecting grandeur, this was not the place to find it. Rhynia grew in mats along wet ground, spreading across damp areas and forming carpets of green sticks. It probably did a good job of holding soil together and helping create the first stable terrestrial ecosystems. But for all its ecological importance, it wasn't much to look at. If you had walked through a Devonian landscape, you might not even have noticed Rhynia underfoot. It was there, certainly, but in the way moss is there. Unremarkable until you're told to pay attention to it. Fossils of Rhynia are well known from a famous site in Scotland called the Rhynie Churt. These fossils preserve the plants in incredible detail, down to their cellular structures. To paleobotanists, this is exciting because it offers a window into the anatomy of some of the first vascular plants. To everyone else, it's a detailed record of something that looks like a bunch of twigs. The big deal about Rhynia is that it represents an early step in the story of plants colonizing land. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't tall, and it didn't inspire awe. But it did show that plants could survive outside water by using internal tubes to carry resources. It was the first draft of a system that would later allow forests, flowers, and crops. Rhynia itself didn't last long. It eventually went extinct without descendants. But its basic idea lived on in nearly every plant afterward. Today, Rhynia is remembered mostly by paleobotanists and students forced to memorize its name. For specialists, it is an iconic example of early land flora. For everyone else, it's a plant you forget immediately after hearing about it. From these tiny pipe cleaner pioneers, we move to something only slightly more advanced. Baragwanathia, an early club moss, was one of the first large vascular plants. Compared to Rhynia, it looked like a giant, though to modern eyes, it still resembled nothing more than a leafy weed. Baragwanathia has the distinction of being one of the earliest large vascular plants, appearing in the late Silurian and Devonian periods. That makes it historically important, though visually it was not much to write home about. It belonged to the club moss group, plants that today survive as small, ground-hugging greenery in damp forests. Baragwanathia, however, was more ambitious. It grew upright stems up to 1 meter tall, which in the Devonian made it practically a giant. Of course, 1 meter is not especially impressive by modern standards. Imagine a weed the size of your leg. That was Baragwanathia. Its stems were covered with narrow, pointed leaves arranged in spirals, giving it a bristly look, like a bottle brush that had seen better days. The leaves contained veins, an innovation at the time, and this made Baragwanathia one of the first plants capable of transporting water efficiently. In other words, it was a pioneer of plumbing, though not the kind anyone would celebrate with parades. Baragwanathia reproduced with spores, produced in cone-like structures at the tips of its stems. This was the standard playbook of early vascular plants. Grow tall enough to release spores into the breeze and hope some landed in the right place. It wasn't a strategy that screamed long-term innovation, but it worked well enough to let Baragwanathia spread across parts of what is now Australia, Europe, and China. Its importance lies mostly in timing. Baragwanathia showed that plants with vascular tissue could grow taller and more robust than earlier, simpler land plants like Cooksonia. It was one of the earliest steps toward forests, even if those forests were more like ankle-high patches of weeds. In paleobotany lectures, this is usually framed as a monumental leap in evolution. In reality, it was a small green stick that stood a little higher than other sticks. Fossils of Baragwanathia are found in fine-grained sediments, often preserving the spiral leaf arrangement in detail. Specialists get excited about these features because they help clarify how vascular plants diversified. Non-specialists look at the fossils and see lines on a rock. The gap between expert enthusiasm and public interest has rarely been wider. Baragwanathia eventually disappeared as more advanced plants developed, but its place in textbooks is secure. It represents a milestone, not flashy, not memorable, but a milestone all the same. It was one of the first weeds to really commit to being tall, and for that, science gives it a polite round of applause. From one of the earliest vascular plants, we now move to something much harder to pronounce. Noegarathiales was an entire order of plants whose name trips up even seasoned paleobotanists. Their contribution was modest. Their biggest challenge was simply existing with a title no one wants to say out loud. Noegarathiales was not a single plant, but an entire order, which sounds grand until you realize how little anyone outside paleobotany has ever cared about it. These plants lived during the late Carboniferous and Permian periods, and they filled swampy habitats, much like so many of their neighbors. Their big distinction? A name that feels less like a plant group and more like a word you'd fail to spell correctly on the first 5 attempts. Members of Noegarathiales resembled small trees or large ferns with broad compound leaves and reproductive structures that grew in cone-like clusters. Some scientists have described them as fern-like gymnosperms, which is a phrase that clears exactly nothing up for the average listener. They weren't true ferns, they weren't true seed plants, and they didn't leave behind modern descendants. They were, in essence, a side branch in plant evolution, a branch that dead-ended quietly and without fanfare. Fossils of Noegarathiales have been found in Europe, Asia, and North America, preserved as leafy impressions in rock. Specialists pore over the details, analyzing the arrangement of veins and spore-bearing structures. For everyone else, the fossils look like the same leafy patterns we've seen from a dozen other extinct plants. If you line them up next to Elethopteris, Neuropteris, and a handful of others, you'd probably struggle to tell them apart. Despite this, Noegarathiales do hold some scientific interest. They illustrate the experimentation of late Paleozoic plants, bridging the gap between spore producers and true seed plants. They remind us that evolution tries many strategies, and not all of them are winners. While conifers eventually thrived and flowering plants took over the world, Noegarathiales fizzled out, leaving behind little more than complicated diagrams in specialist papers. Their extinction came during the upheavals of the Permian, when climate changes and mass extinctions swept away many lineages. The plants never returned, and their odd mix of fern-like and seed-like traits vanished with them. Today, their main role is frustrating students who must memorize their name without tripping over the syllables. So, While Noegarathiales may have once covered wide areas of swampy ground, their modern legacy is mostly linguistic, a word that few can say and fewer can remember. From a whole order of plants with an unpronounceable name, we now turn to something much smaller, much simpler, and, if possible, even less exciting. Zosterophyllum was one of the earliest vascular plants, notable not for grandeur, but for branching stems that looked like little more than green plumbing fixtures. Zosterophyllum lived during the Silurian and Devonian periods, and it holds the distinction of being one of the earliest vascular plants. That makes it historically significant, though in practice, it looked like something you might accidentally step on without noticing. Its stems were thin, leafless, and branched irregularly, with small sporangia, spore cases, sprouting from the sides. Imagine a green pipe with little nozzles attached at random angles, and you've more or less pictured Zosterophyllum. Unlike Cooksonia, which simply grew upright stalks with capsules on top, Zosterophyllum experimented with branching. This might sound like an exciting development, but the results were not spectacular. The branches were short, stubby, and produced spores in clusters. It was the biological equivalent of doodling in the margins rather than drawing anything meaningful. Still, paleobotanists point to Zosterophyllum as an important step in the evolution of vascular plants, one of the many small, incremental tweaks that eventually led to something resembling a real plant. Fossils of Zosterophyllum are found in fine-grained sediments, often as delicate impressions of its slender stems. Specialists admire these fossils for the insight they provide into early plant evolution. Non-specialists usually mistake them for scratches on rock or roots of some more interesting plant. The truth is, Zosterophyllum doesn't have much visual impact, and that's saying something in a lineup where most of the competition already looks like sticks. Ecologically, Zosterophyllum was part of the low vegetation carpeting the Earth's surface during the Devonian. It grew near wetlands and streams, forming mats of thin stems. Its contribution was modest but essential. It helped stabilize soils and expand plant life further onto land. Without such humble pioneers, larger plants might never have evolved. Of course, that doesn't make Zosterophyllum exciting. It just makes it necessary, like screws in a chair, invisible unless missing, and unappreciated when present. The plant eventually went extinct, leaving no direct descendants. Its main legacy is being studied as a stem group, a term paleobotanists use for lineages that were early experiments leading to modern plant groups, but didn't themselves survive. In other words, Zosterophyllum is remembered as a prototype that worked just well enough to be replaced. Today, its name is mostly encountered in paleobotany papers, where it occupies the role of yet another Devonian plant with spores. Its story isn't one of drama or grandeur, but of small steps in a very long process. From a spindly branching pioneer, we move to something even less conspicuous, to Mesipteris elongata, a tiny fern ally. If you thought small plants couldn't get more forgettable, you may want to brace yourself. Mesipteris elongata was a small, fern-like plant, though even fern-like may oversell it. It belonged to the group of whisk ferns, primitive vascular plants that lack true roots and true leaves. Instead, they sported slender stems with tiny appendages that only pretended to be leaves. Mesipteris elongata lived quietly in the understory, barely reaching a few centimeters in height. If the Carboniferous swamp giants were the skyscrapers of their time. Temesipteris elongata was the weed growing in the sidewalk crack. Its stems were elongated, as the name suggests, and bore little sporangia, spore cases, directly on their sides. This gave the plant a sparse, stick-like appearance, with the occasional bump where spores were produced. Fossils preserve these features in faint detail, usually requiring a trained eye to spot them at all. To most people, they look like scratches in stone. To paleobotanists, they are one more reminder of how humble early land plants really were. Temesipteris elongata didn't dominate landscapes, didn't build forests, and didn't leave behind coal seams. It simply grew in small patches, reproducing by spores, and existing at the edges of ecosystems. Its ecological role was minor but real, adding a little greenery to the ground cover and contributing to the slow expansion of vascular plants. Think of it as the background character in a play, present in every scene, but with no lines and no one noticing when it exits. As with many small early plants, Temesipteris elongata eventually vanished. It left no direct descendants, though modern whisk ferns like Psilotum resemble it closely enough to suggest a distant connection. Its extinction was quiet, unnoticed at the time, and largely unnoticed ever since. Today, its name surfaces mostly in technical papers cataloguing the diversity of ancient flora. For students encountering it for the first time, Temesipteris elongata is often memorable only because of the effort required to spell it. Beyond that, it is a plant that inspires little more than polite acknowledgement before attention shifts to something bigger and more dramatic. In the grand scheme, Temesipteris elongata demonstrates that not every plant in Earth's history was a towering tree or a lush fern. Some were barely noticeable twigs that carried spores, played their small part, and disappeared. From a tiny, nearly invisible plant, we move to something slightly larger, but no less underwhelming. Horneophyton, with its forked stems and spore capsules, looked like little more than a green pipe cleaner stuck into the ground. Horneophyton was a small plant from the Devonian period, and by small, we mean very small. It rarely reached more than 20 centimeters in height, which made it one of the less imposing members of early land flora. If you picture a pipe cleaner with a fork at the end, you've got a fairly accurate idea of what it looked like. Horneophyton was not trying to impress anyone, and it succeeded. Its stems were leafless, slender, and often branched into simple forks. At the ends of these forks sat sporangia, round capsules that released spores. That was its entire design. No leaves, no roots, no complex structures, just a stem, a fork, and a capsule. In terms of innovation, Horneophyton was the bare minimum required to call something a land plant. Fossils of Horneophyton are best known from the Rhynie Chert in Scotland, the same site that preserved Rhynia in exquisite detail. The fossils show the sporangia attached like little bulbs at the tips of the stems, sometimes with faint lines indicating where the spores were stored. To paleobotanists, this is fascinating evidence of early plant reproduction. To everyone else, it looks like squiggles in stone. Ecologically, Horneophyton grew in damp environments, forming clusters of tiny stems in areas that were periodically flooded. It did not dominate landscapes or build forests, but it contributed to the patchy carpets of vegetation that slowly spread across Devonian terrain. Its role was modest: hold soil in place, photosynthesize, and scatter spores into the breeze. Despite its humble form, Horneophyton has a small claim to fame. Its anatomy shows a mix of primitive and slightly more advanced features, making it a transitional plant between the very earliest land pioneers and the more complex vascular plants that followed. This has made it a useful study subject for scientists trying to piece together how plants evolved. Of course, useful does not always mean interesting. Horneophyton eventually vanished without leaving direct descendants. Its moment in evolutionary history was brief, and its design was quickly overshadowed by taller, leafier plants that could do the same job more efficiently. Today, it survives only as a name in textbooks and a handful of carefully labeled fossils in drawers. And with that, we are nearly at the end of our journey. From towering swamp trees to tiny pipe cleaners, we've covered plants both oversized and underwhelming. Our final entry is Pachytesta, not even a whole plant, but just the seeds of seed ferns. If you thought cones were boring, wait until you meet prehistoric seeds that didn't even get eaten. Pachytesta is a name that sounds like it should belong to a dinosaur, but it doesn't. It wasn't even a plant in its own right. Pachytesta refers to the fossilized seeds of extinct seed ferns, especially those from the Carboniferous and Permian periods. In other words, we've reached the point where paleobotanists not only named the plants, but also decided the seeds themselves deserved separate names. When the most interesting part of a plant's story is its pea-sized offspring, you know you're in the right place for the boring files. The seeds were typically small, rounded structures, preserved in rock with their protective coatings intact. They were among the earliest examples of seeds that we can clearly recognize in the fossil record. This was an evolutionary step forward, marking the gradual shift away from spores. Of course, in practice, they didn't look like milestones. They looked like lumps. Scientists value Pachytesta because these fossils help explain how early seeds evolved, showing the gradual transition from spore-based plants to true seed-bearing ones. But for non-specialists, Pachytesta is indistinguishable from any other pebble trapped in stone. Unless you're told otherwise, you'd never guess you were looking at one of the pivotal innovations in plant history. It's a little like finding the first wheel, only it's square, made of clay, and immediately discarded. As for what Pachytesta contributed to its environment, the answer is limited. They were seeds, after all. Their job was to carry genetic material to the next generation of seed ferns. They were never eaten by humans, never ground into flour, and never roasted as snacks. They were dropped into the soil, occasionally sprouted, and just as often fossilized, waiting millions of years for someone to mistake them for something more exciting. Pachytesta eventually disappeared along with the seed ferns that produced them. More advanced seed plants took over, developing cones, larger seeds, and eventually flowers and fruit. Compared to those later successes, Pachytesta feels like a rough draft, important in theory, forgettable in practice. Today, Pachytesta sits in paleobotany collections, catalogued with care. Specialists may spend time measuring their size or examining their structure, but outside of those circles, they rarely inspire awe. If anything, they are most memorable for reminding us just how far scientists will go to make sure everything, no matter how trivial, gets a name. And with that, our tour is complete. We have walked past towering scale trees, hollow horsetails, shaggy ferns, green pipe cleaners, wedge leaves, and finally, lumps of fossilized seed. Together, they tell the story of plants that lived, died, and slipped into obscurity. remembered only because someone took the trouble to label their remains. So the next time you struggle to fall asleep, remember Pachitesta, proof that even the most important evolutionary innovations can look boring enough to put you right to bed. And if, against all odds, you've made it this far, congratulations. That is no small feat. Most people would have dozed off somewhere around lepidodendron, and frankly, we wouldn't blame them. But if you're still awake, leave a comment below and let us know you survived the boring files. Extinct plants nobody cares about. You've accomplished what may be one of the most uneventful marathons in YouTube history. Now close your eyes, drift off, and rest easy, knowing you'll never have to think about these plants again.